Hi students, I hope you're doing great, and in this video we're going to be discussing about the disadvantages of free trade, or you can say what are the reasons why the government implements protectionism policies on international trade or free trade, or why does the government implements trade barriers. So let's get started. So I've written a few reasons here. So let's see the first reason that I've written. So the first reason, or you can say the first argument that the government uses to justify the implementation of the trade barriers or the protectionist measures is the infant industry argument. Now, these infant industries are basically those small industries that lack economies of scale to compete with the industries and the firms in developed economies, right? And this argument becomes particularly strong when we are saying that our developing economies or poor countries, they are trying to diversify or expand or indulge into other sectors, such as from the primary sector to, let's say, they want to indulge and expand into the manufacturing sector, or let's say the tertiary sector, because of the reasons, because there's a significant risk that there might be over specialization in the primary sector. So in order to avoid that risk, these developing or poor countries want to indulge themselves into manufacturing sectors and into tertiary sector. Now, if the government wants that it is possible for our infant industries to expand themselves into the manufacturing and the tertiary sectors, the government needs to protect them from foreign competition against large industries and large companies in those developed countries who benefit from economies of scale, and as a result of that they can actually sell their products in the domestic market at a very low price as compared to these infant industries in our domestic economy, right? And then there's also another reason. There's something that is known as the resource curse. Now guys, what is resource curse? Resource curse basically is an economic terminology that stands for a situation where the developing countries, they have all the natural resources, they have all those natural ingredients to make and sell and trade into primary commodities, but then despite the fact that they have all the resources, these developing economies are unable to trade into primary sector commodities, and that is why they want to diversify into the manufacturing and the tertiary sector. But they will only be able to diversify or expand in the manufacturing or tertiary sector if they do not face that significant competition from foreign developed companies selling their products at a very low price, and because they are benefiting from significant economies of scale. So again, there is that risk of resource curse that exists in developing economies as well, despite the fact that they have all the resources for producing primary commodities. But then again, because they have a rich source of raw material, we know that these developing countries have rich sources of raw materials or natural resources, but they can still struggle to make effective use of them. And that is what the resource curse is all about, that there's a curse on the resources. Despite the fact that you have the resources, you're unable to develop yourself economically and use those resources to increase GDP and output and economic growth. So guys, that is why you see these developing countries, they want to expand and diversify into manufacturing sector to overcome the risk of the resource curse, and also to overcome the risk of over specialization in primary sector industries, right? To overcome the risk of over reliance in primary sector industries, because that creates huge dependency on generating revenues and GDP from the primary sector. But then again, this will only be possible if they do not face strong competition from foreign firms. That is why the government actually tries to protect our infant industry, so that they are able to achieve their goals and expand into manufacturing and tertiary sector as well. So what can the government do? The government can simply impose protectionist policies or trade barriers that allows these small firms. You can also call these infant industries as sunrise firms, right? Because these are small industries, you can also call them sunrise firms, as because it gives them the time to expand, it gives them the time to grow, they can get bigger, and then they can benefit from any potential economies of scale that they may have. And how will this help the domestic infant industries? It will help them that if they have any potential comparative or absolute advantage, if they have any potential comparative or if they have any potential absolute advantage, if they have any potential absolute or comparative advantages, these infant domestic industries, then protecting these infant industries from foreign competition, from significant foreign competition, will actually help the government or the state to nurture and preserve their potential and comparative and absolute advantage, and actually build on it further, so that this potential comparative advantage or absolute advantage can actually be materialized and realized, and significant gains from trade can be made using the international trade theory. But this will only be happening if this comparative and potential advantage is actually realized. But if there's a lot of foreign competition that our infant industries have to be faced with, then these infant industries will ultimately shut down and they will be just thrown out of the market. So protecting our infant industries will actually help them grow, and they can compete with more established industries in the near future. So that is one of the reasons why the government protects infant industries, and that is known as the infant industry argument. But again, like I said, like I always emphasize the fact that you also need to evaluate in exams, right? So what is evaluation? Evaluation just means that you are telling the examiner or bringing the examiner to a certain set of argument or a certain set of point. You're trying to give him your own viewpoint of something that you've already stated, but you're trying to give him a perspective and trying to build or develop an argument, and then coming to a certain point. So for example, if you're saying that the government protects the domestic industries, and that is why, to protect the domestic industries or the infant industries, protectionism is imposed, then when you are evaluating protectionism, then you also have to say that okay, fine, we agree that protectionism does helps the benefit infant industries, and infant industry argument is a strong argument that favors the need for government actually imposing trade barriers. But then again, the fact that protectionism might also create something that is known as protectionism dependency. Now this is again an economic term, use those terms, because protectionism dependency actually means that it will make our domestic infant firms dependent on these protectionist measures. So although yes, it may benefit them in the short run or in the short term, but again, if protectionism is resulting into complacencies, and if the firms become complacent, and it creates a protectionist dependency on the government's protectionist policies, so in that case the infant firms might become something that is known as X inefficient. So they may become X inefficient, and they might not purposely try to reduce their cost of production, and that will actually help, and that will actually basically prevent the cost of production from decreasing to an extent that it could have. So the cost of production could have been decreased or reduced to a significantly large extent, and the firm would have become a lot more competitive than it is currently if the firm would not have been X inefficient. But because of being complacent, because of being dependent on protectionist measures, it has actually resulted into firms becoming X inefficient, and that does not allows the firm to it creates a lot of questions, or raises concerns on the fact that whether protectionism should be imposed or should not be imposed. Now this is all what evaluation is all about, right? You're trying to question the narrative that you've already established before, right? So moving forward, there's another point that you can make while evaluating the infant industry argument, and that is retaliation. What is retaliation? Retaliation simply means that if you impose a trade barrier, let's say you impose a tariff or a quota, right, in the other country, because you have stopped their, or you have reduced their exports, right, so the other country would retaliate by doing the same to you. But then again, the extent on which they might retaliate, or the extent of retaliation, might differ. So let's say if you have imposed a 10% tariff on your imports from, let's say, country A, then country A might impose a, let's say, 15% tariff on your exports to that particular country A, right? So in that case, in that case, when that happens, you can say that protectionism makes you more worse off, right? Because it offset. So the benefits of protectionism are actually offset, and there's a net loss to society, because instead of gains from trade taking place, it has resulted into negative gains, or you can say instead of gains, it has resulted into a net loss to society, in the sense that instead of being better off, it has resulted into the country being worse off, because the extent of retaliation exceeded the amount of the extent of tariff that you had actually imposed, right? So again, you don't know how will the other country retaliate, and then again the fact that you are so if you're a poor country, then do you have enough significant international power to actually implement imposing protectionism policies on developed economies, like let's say a poor country like, let's say, Pakistan, for example? Then whether a poor country like Pakistan, does it has the international power or the socio-economic power on international fronts that can it actually impose a tariff on, let's say, imports from the United States or from Germany, right? Because these are powerful countries, right? They have international worth, they have international representation in foreign organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations, right? So and then again, the fact that if developing countries do, or it even if they do implement certain amount of protectionism or tariffs, it may result into damaging consequences or damaging repercussions that they might not have predicted, right? And that again makes the whole idea of protectionism concerning, or questioning the fact that whether protectionism is really beneficial or not, and whether are you really better off or worse off from protectionism. So this is the kind of wordings that I'm using, and the kind of thought process that I'm trying to generate in your minds, guys. This is what you need to learn, and that is how you will evaluate in your exam, and that is how you will score the best of the marks. Okay, so the next reason why protectionist measures are justified, or why the government might impose trade barriers, is because of the dumping argument. Now, guys, what exactly is dumping? Now, dumping is basically the selling of a product in the overseas market, that is in the foreign markets, at a price that is below the cost of production, right? And why does this happen? Why do overseas firms actually dump their product in domestic markets? This is because these are large multinational firms who are already benefiting from significant economies of scale, and that is why they have the capacity, or they have the potential to actually sell at a below cost, and they can sustain that loss, right? And then once they capture that market share, they can again increase the prices in the domestic markets. But then this is not the only reason. A lot of students do write this reason, but that is not the only reason why firms dump their products just to get or capture a market share. Or it's not necessary that there are large organizations are the only organizations that are dumping their products in overseas markets, right? So another reason why actually these products are dumped in foreign markets is because maybe their governments have given them extremely significant or heavy subsidies that has significantly reduced their cost of production, and made them capable enough to actually dump their products in international markets and then capture that market share as well. Or maybe the governments have implemented price controls. Maybe they have given them a minimum price scheme, and because of that minimum price that the government has implemented, that has resulted into an excess supply or a surplus. And then what happens is that those firms are, because of that, because now that surplus has to be dealt with, right? So those overseas firms are actually dumping that surplus stock that is not being sold in their domestic market into the domestic markets of those developing poor countries, right? And again, they are causing a huge significant threat to the domestic firms within those developing economies, right? And then what happens is, guys, that when countries they have this feeling that their products are being dumped in the markets, what happens is that the government is most likely to implement protectionism. And in that case, what happens is that if protectionism is not imposed because of dumping, what will happen is that if they do not impose some form of trade barriers, it will result into our domestic industry to decline, or again the infant industry argument takes place. Or it may result into unemployment, that is structural unemployment. And then you can also say that there will be a lot of anger and aggression against the political establishment and the current political government as well, because if they're not taking any action against those countries that are actually accused of dumping their products into the domestic markets, because it again results into an unfair sort of a competition, because obviously those products that are being dumped in domestic markets, the domestic producers have a different cost setup. They have a different set of cost, raw material, labor, overhead costs being faced within the domestic countries, and those countries that are actually dumping their products are faced with a different set of costs. Maybe their governments have supported them through excessive subsidies, right? So it's kind of unfair comparison being made. So obviously the consumer will go for foreign products or for foreign brands, but then again it's an unfair competition, because it's not our countries or our domestic firms' fault that they're not able to produce at such a competitive cost, because maybe they have not actually produced at a much competitive cost, but in fact you can say that the government has given them huge subsidy, and that has actually resulted into an artificial decline in cost of production, right? So that is why dumping might cause serious consequences, and why trade barriers are then justified, right? But again, the fact that you need to evaluate dumping as well, and in that case what you will say is that okay, fine, we agree that dumping is good, but then again the fact that proving the accuracy of dumping is extremely difficult, because dumping is not easy to prove, right? Dumping is difficult to prove, because finding information regarding the cost of production and then proving that the products were being dumped by the overseas firms in the domestic market purposefully, right? And they were, and that the fact that they were purposefully dumped and purposefully sold at prices that were below the cost of production is a real challenge, is actually a challenge for the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization is the organization that is actually governing, it is a regulatory body that is governing the global trade. So it's challenge for the World Trade Organization to actually prove that thing. So if let's say what happens is that if certain form of trade barriers or protectionist measures are imposed by, let's say, a country, and they are just imposed due to dumping that is not yet proven, right? That is yet to be proven. Or you can say that the protectionist or the trade barriers are imposed because of perceived dumping. Now, what am I saying? I've used a term that I'm saying as perceived dumping. Now, what is perceived dumping? Perceived dumping means dumping that has not been actually proven. So the country is perceiving it as dumping, but it's yet to be proven, right? So if protectionist measures are actually imposed because of perceived dumping, and you're accusing a country that they have dumped their products into domestic market. Let's say if Pakistan accuses China that China is dumping their products in Pakistani markets, then again China may feel that it has been wrongly targeted, right? And then again China may retaliate heavily in return. And then again, this kind of, and again this will result into some form of a tit for tat protectionism that will actually benefit no one. So there won't be any gains from trade, right? It will actually lose. Both China and Pakistan will suffer. Both will be made worse off. The global trades, the global trade and the global consumption and production, instead of increasing, would actually decline, and the global output would decline in that case, because both countries will be, and their living standards would be made worse off. So yes, you can argue that yes, what a better solution to a problem like this, or better solution to a scenario where it's not easy to prove dumping, and instead of just imposing dumping, so you could evaluate by saying that instead of just imposing trade barriers, sorry, not imposing dumping, my bad, but just instead of imposing trade barriers, a better solution to that problem would be to bring World Trade Organization into as a middleman, and then kind of have those trade talks through the World Trade Organization to resolve such disputes on diplomatic fronts, right? Rather than engaging into a trade war. So instead of engaging into a trade war, just try to resolve those disputes on diplomatic fronts, so that the international relations between both the countries are not harmed and they are preserved over the long term, and then a sustainable form of a solution is reached by both the parties, right? So these are the two very strong points that you can make in your exam, and these are, in this video I've covered two very important arguments why protectionism is also imposed. So stay tuned, guys. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care with more reasons why protectionism is imposed.